When we combine all three of our curves together onto one Cartesian plane, we're going to be able to get our semblance of what macroeconomic equilibrium is. We have the LRAS, which is vertical at our full employment level of GDP. We have SRAS, it's upward sloping, and we have aggregate demand, which is downward sloping. The first type of equilibrium we can talk about is short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and it's going to occur where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect. So here, aggregate demand, it intersects SRAS at point E. So at point E, we are in short-run equilibrium. And short-run equilibrium details exactly where we are currently in terms of our economy. So at point E, we are operating at our full employment level of GDP, and we have a price level equal to PE. The second type of equilibrium we can take a look at is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and it occurs where aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply intersect. So I'm actually going to change this up a little bit. It's going to be where all three of our curves intersect with one another. So it occurs where aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply, all three of these curves intersect at one point. So the vast majority of examples that we take a look at for our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, all three of these curves are going to intersect at the same exact point. So at point E, we are also in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. LRAS, SRAS, AD, they all intersect at the same point. So at point E, we are both in short-run and long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So remember that in the long run, this is exactly where we're going to be converging to. It details exactly what our full employment level of GDP or potential GDP should be. However, remember there are going to be short-run fluctuations around the long run. We don't always have to be operating at QF or at the LRAS curve all the time, because sometimes there can be good times, there can be bad times within the economy, and this is exactly where we are sort of currently. So let's go ahead and detail a little bit more in depth about this short-run equilibrium so you have a better idea of what it looks like graphically. Here we take a look at short-run equilibrium. Equilibrium. So short-run equilibrium. First of all, suppose that we end up in a situation as such. We have aggregate demand right here. We have short-run aggregate supply, SRAS, and then we suppose we have LRAS up here, all LRAS with the price level and GDP. Ooh. So shifting all the way down here, all the way with Q, so our output right here. So at point A, exactly where we have SRAS intersecting our aggregate demand curve, what type of equilibrium are we in? We're going to be in a short-run equilibrium because that's the only two curves that intersect. We have SRAS and aggregate demand. And at point A, what do we notice? We notice that we have a price level equal to PL0, we can call it, and we have Q1 level of GDP. Remember that LRAS, we have a Q star level of GDP. It's QFE, it's our full employment GDP, and that's exactly where we should be in the long run. However, in the short run, we're operating a little bit below that. So at point A, what is the economy doing? Is it doing well or is it doing poorly? It is doing quite poorly in this instance because our current level of GDP is below our full employment GDP, so we can consider ourselves to be in some type of recession. And this is exactly our idea of what the recessionary gap is going to look like graphically. We talked about this in the previous chapter. So recessionary gap. So I spelled that terribly. Let me spell that one more time. Recessionary gap. So the recessionary gap, remember, it's the amount of spending that needs to increase in order for us to get pushed out of the recession. So here we actually need to have spending increases in order for us to move from the short-run equilibrium into something that is more of a long-run equilibrium to get back to our Q star or QFE level of GDP. On the other hand, we don't have to be operating below, so sometimes the economy is doing poorly, but other times the economy might be doing very, very well, above its long-run equilibrium. And this is where we come to this graph right here. So here we have SRAS, we have aggregate demand, and suppose we're operating on the other side of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So we have price level, we have GDP, and suppose that we're operating at, once again, maybe say point B right here. What do we notice about point B? At point B, we notice that we are above our Q star level, our QFE level, at Q1 right here. So what is the economy doing at point B? Once again, this is going to be seen as a short-run equilibrium because this is exactly where only SRAS and aggregate demand intersect with one another. Here, we're going to denote that anytime we're operating above Q star, the economy is going to be above full employment. Above full employment. So here we're actually in some type of boom. The economy may be overheating just a little bit. And what can we call this? How do we get rid of this sort of gap? How do we get back to our long-run equilibrium? Remember, just the opposite of the recessionary gap is something known as the inflationary gap. Inflationary gap. So remember, the inflationary gap is the spending decreases we need to have within the economy in order to get us back to our full employment GDP level. So in all of this, we notice that we don't always have to be operating in long-run equilibrium where all three of these curves are intersecting at the same exact point. There are times within the business cycle where we may be a little bit low. In the business cycle, we're in some type of recession. We may be a little bit high. We may be in some type of peak or some type of boom. But in the long run, this is exactly what we should be seeing in the long run, where all three of these curves intersect with one another, and we're going to end up in our happy little place in long-run equilibrium with a full employment level or full employment GDP as such. So Q star, that is our happy little place. So with all of this, there are a few things that we can do in order to sort of induce more analysis and more interpretations, and that's where we go ahead and take a look at, once again, single and simultaneous shifts of SRAS and aggregate demand in order to see where our new macroeconomic equilibrium is going to lie. So just like what we did in chapter number 3, we're going to go ahead and do the same fashion, same sort of questions, same sort of examples with the next videos. I'll see you guys there.